Hello everyone. Welcome to another session of neurolocomotor physiology. Today we are going to look at um, the roles of other parts of the nervous system in the control of body movements. So we start with the role of the brainstem, where we are going to look at the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla, and the structures that are related are located in these brainstem areas that are involved in the control of body movements. And we are also going to look at the role of the diencephalon, mainly the thalamus, in controlling movements. So we are also going to see the spinal cord, the role of the spinal cord, and the role of the final common pathway in the control of body movements. So that is what we are going to look at today. So let's begin with the brainstem. What is the role of the brainstem in controlling movement? What are those structures that are located in the brainstem? So we start with the midbrain. So the midbrain, when you look at the midbrain, we have the superior and inferior colliculus. If you can still remember, when we are looking at the visual and auditory pathways, we came across the superior and inferior colliculi in those pathways. So in the midbrain, we have several nuclei present, which contributes to control of skeletal muscles, motor control of skeletal muscles. Those nuclei, for example, we have the superior and inferior colliculi located in the tectum of the midbrain, and they are involved in visual and auditory reflexes respectively. If you can still remember our spatial senses, we looked at these two, excuse me, we saw these two nuclei and their functions when it comes to visual and auditory reflexes. So how are they concerned with control of body movements? The tectospinal tracts, remember what we said about the extrapyramidal tracts, those tracts that are originating outside the motor cortex. We call them the indirect pathways. The direct pathways are the motor tracts that originate from the motor cortex, the premotor cortex, the motor cortex itself, the supplementary motor area. Those are the tracts that originate from those motor areas. We call them the direct pathways. The indirect pathways are those pathways, motor pathways, that originate from extrapyramidal structures, from the cerebellum, from the radionucleus, from the tectum, like we have seen here, the tectospinal tracts. So the tectospinal tract originating from the superior colliculus mediates reflex postural movement of the head in response to visual and auditory stimuli. Remember, the superior colliculus is a structure in the midbrain that integrates visual reflexes. If you can still remember when we talked about, or when we looked at the visual pathway, okay? So we move ahead. Still on the superior and inferior colliculus, the tectocerebellar tract that emerges from the tectum of the midbrain, which houses or contains the superior and inferior colliculi on both sides, terminates in the intermediate vermis of the cerebellum. The intermediate vermis of the cerebellum via the superior cerebellar peduncles. So that is where the tectocerebellar tracts emerging from the superior and inferior colliculi on both sides terminates. They terminate in the cerebellum. So it is widely believed that that tract mediates visual and auditory reflexes. So visual and auditory reflexes are also coordinated, are also sent for integration in the cerebellum, and they enter the cerebellum via the superior cerebellar peduncle. So we are talking about the role of the brainstem in the control of movement. We are still looking at the structures of the midbrain. So we have the radionucleus that we had already seen in the previous lectures that I gave to you. The radionucleus is that structure in the tegmentum of the midbrain that is involved in coordination of sensory motor information. Remember, during the integration of motor impulses within the motor cortex and the cerebellum, it has to pass through the red nucleus. Okay, as it passes through the red nucleus, before the information is now processed or projected to the motor cortex. Okay, and the same thing happens when we have sensory information coming in from the Golgi tendon organs or the proprioceptors. Before they are relayed into the cerebellum, they have to pass through the red nucleus. So now, still on the midbrain, the red nucleus, what happens in the red nucleus there? Efferent fibers of the superior cerebellar peduncle. Efferent fibers from the superior cerebellar peduncle, the major output system of the cerebellum, surrounds and partially terminates in the red nucleus. You see now. So efferent fibers from the Purkinje cells of the cerebellar cortex, efferent fibers from there, from the cerebellum, exit via the superior cerebellar peduncle. That is the major output system of the cerebellum. So as they emerge from the cerebellum, they have to terminate or pass through the red nucleus before ascending to the thalamus. And from the thalamus, they relay the motor inputs or the motor sensations to the motor cortex. So the ascending fibers of this bundle terminates in the thalamic nuclei, which I have already talked about here, and which have access to the primary motor cortex. So that pathway is known as the dentorubro-thalamic cortical tract. So the function of that tract is to regulate and coordinate motor activities. So we are still on the brainstem in control of movements. How does the brainstem function in the control of body movement? It functions by having these nuclei located in specific places that helps to relay sensory and motor information either up to the motor cortex or down to the cerebellum and other related structures. So we move on to, still on that red nucleus, we see that the motor and sensory cortex contributes corticorubral tracts, which contains neurons that connect primary motor and sensory areas to the red nucleus. So as we are having the descending tract, the primary or the direct pathway from the motor cortex and the sensory areas, as they are descending, they have to pass through the red nucleus. So we have the corticorubral tract from the motor cortex to the red nucleus. Okay, the corticorubral tract from the motor cortex to the red nucleus, and from the red nucleus, as it comes to the red nucleus, it descends as the rubrospinal tract. It also descends as the corticospinal tract. So collaterals are sent to the red nucleus, and there are also fibers that descend directly into the motor nuclei of the spinal cord. So the rubrospinal tract is responsible for regulation of flexor and inhibition of extensor tone, as well as fine motor control of the upper limb. That is the function of the red nucleus. Okay, so the rubrospinal tract is responsible for regulation of flexor and inhibition of extensor tone, as well as fine motor control of the upper limb. So that is what happens. So what do we have again? So the red nucleus, still on it, a number of collateral fibers from the cerebellum synapse on the large cells in the caudal region of the red nucleus. Excuse me. So already I talked about this. Afferent or efferent fibers arising from the cerebellum might also send collaterals to the red nucleus. Knowing fully well the function of the red nucleus, that the red nucleus gives rise to the rubrospinal tract, And the rubrospinal tract is responsible for regulation of flexor and inhibiting of extensor muscle tone, as well as fine motor control of the upper limb. Okay, so we also have another connection between the red nucleus and the cerebellum, which I've already explained. So this is the details of that connection here. So the number of collaterals from the cerebellum synapse on the large cells of the red nucleus, and this gives rise to crossed fibers of the rubrospinal tract. So that tells you that the rubrospinal tract arising from the red nucleus has crossed and uncrossed fibers, which will descend to the spinal cord, which is also influenced overall by the motor cortex. Remember, the motor cortex also sends descending tracts that passes through the red nucleus. So those are the roles of the brainstem in the control of movement. So we have these structures, the red nucleus being number one. Then we also have the superior and inferior colliculus being number two. All these structures are located in the midbrain, in the midbrain of the brainstem. So functions of the rubrospinal tract is to control muscle tone in the flexor muscle groups. It's the same thing like I have said here, which I said that tract is responsible for regulation of flexor and inhibition of extensor tone, as well as fine motor control of the upper limb. So that means the red nucleus is mostly concerned with regulation of muscles, flexor and extensor muscles tone, as well as fine motor control of the upper limb, mainly of the upper limb. So now, this summarizes what we have just said about the rubrospinal tract. So that is why I'm saying the function of the rubrospinal tract is the control of muscle tone in the flexor muscle groups in the upper limb, okay? All right, so still on the midbrain, we move to the reticular formation now. The reticular formation. So in the reticular formation, we have descending reticulospinal tracts from the reticular formation of the midbrain, and they are involved mainly in locomotion and postural control. The reticular formation of the midbrain, you know where the reticular formation is located in the brainstem. So the reticular formation are also a nuclei that are responsible for extrapyramidal tracts. We call those extrapyramidal or indirect tracts, motor tracts, reticulospinal tracts. And this is the function of the reticulospinal tracts here. Okay. So we move. So we move to the substantia nigra. The substantia nigra still in the midbrain. The substantia nigra, we have seen a substantia nigra. We have also always seen the functions of the substantia nigra. We have seen the interaction of the substantia nigra with the basal ganglia, a component of basal ganglia. We have seen the connections between the substantia nigra and the basal ganglia. So dopaminergic neurons project to the corpus striatum of the basal ganglia for motor coordination and modulating motor movements. The corpus striatum. So when you talk about the corpus striatum of the basal ganglia, you're talking about the caudate nucleus and the putamen. And already you know the functions of the basal ganglia in planning, organizing, refining, and coordinating motor movements. So when we say that the substantia nigra, being a component of the basal ganglia, has projections, dopaminergic neurons that project to the corpus striatum, you know now that it is also involved in motor coordination or modulating motor movement. So this diagram shows you the pons. We have now finished with the midbrain. We have now gone to the pons. But this diagram here shows you the connections between the cerebellum and the motor cortex. You can see the fibers passing from the cerebellum here. The fibers connecting the cerebellum to the thalamus, and from the thalamus to the cerebral cortex. So that is the connections between the cerebellum and the motor cortex. Okay, so for example, when you look at the pons, we are done with the midbrain now. The pons is a group of nerves that function as a connection between the cerebrum and the cerebellum. You can see the pons is here. It functions as a bridge that connects fibers, different fibers from the cerebellum to the cerebral cortex. And as well as from the cerebral cortex, as it passes down, descends the descending tracts, descending down, passing through the radionucleus, they project into the cerebellum. So that shows you that the cerebellum and the cerebral cortex are interconnected. They are also involved in planning and execution of movements. And that also shows you the function of the cerebellum. The function of the cerebellum in comparing the comparator function of the cerebellum during execution of movement. The cerebellum also compares the planned movements in the cortex and the executed movement. The planned and the executed movement. Is it rhyming? Is the movement going according to plan? So that's what happens. So the pons is there in between to connect these two structures there. So the pon is like a bridge. Okay, the pon is like a bridge, the pons. So you can see the output from the Purkinje cells to the dentate nucleus, and from the dentate nucleus in the cerebellum, the deep nuclei of the cerebellum, fibers arise there, passes through the radionucleus along somewhere here, and from there, the radionucleus, the fibers extend to the ventrolateral nucleus of thalamus before projecting to the cerebral cortex. So that is the dento-rubro-thalamic cortical tract. So that is what we have explained there now. So for the pons, the surface fibers in the pons connect to the cerebellum, like we have seen there, the surface fibers, and the deeper fibers are part of the motor and sensory tract. So that shows you that as the motor and sensory tract are descending, for example, as the motor tract is descending from the cerebral cortex, as it's going down to the spinal cord as the corticospinal tract, it passes through the pons. As the sensory fibers also ascend, the ascending systems, they also pass through the pons. They pass through the pons before they reach the midbrain and project to the somatosensory cortex. So that is what I have explained here. Like I've said, the deep fibers are part of the motor and sensory tracts that pass from the medulla through the pons and onto the midbrain, and vice versa. The deeper fibers are the motor and sensory tracts. So that is the role of the pons. So the pons is like a bridge connecting fibers, motor and sensory, as they are transversing up and down from the motor cortex down to the cerebellum, down to the spinal cord. So now the medulla, we move from the pons itself to the next structure in the brainstem. The role of the medulla in the control of movements. What are the structures that are located in the medulla that plays a role in the control of movements? Descending and ascending fiber tract provides communication between the spinal cord and the brain. Those fibers, those descending and ascending fibers providing communication between the spinal cord itself and the brain must pass through the medulla. We saw that. We saw most of the decussation of the sensory tract are at the level of the medulla. The same thing happens to the descending motor tracts. Most of the crossing over is at the level of the medulla, crossing over to contralateral sites on the pyramids. Remember that. Okay, so that is for the corticospinal tracts. And don't forget, So we have the inferior olivary nucleus. The inferior olivary nucleus is located in the medulla. We are looking at the structures that are responsible for voluntary movement control in the brainstem. Now, in the medulla, we have the inferior olivary nucleus located at the medulla. What does it do? It coordinates proprioceptive signals from the spinal cord to the cerebellum via the posterior spinocerebellar tract. If you can still remember, one of the ascending pathways, the spinocerebellar tract. So the posterior spinocerebellar tract passes through the inferior olivary nucleus located in the medulla before it enters the cerebellum. The function of that tract is to regulate motor coordination and learning, motor learning, because it terminates in the spinocerebellum. That tract terminates in the spinocerebellum. So inferior olivary nucleus is located at the medulla. Now, where is the superior olivary nucleus located, and what is the function of the superior olivary nucleus? Okay, the superior olivary nucleus is located in the pons. If you can still remember, the pons, the superior olivary nucleus is located in the pons. And what is the function of that superior olivary nucleus? Remember when we talked about auditory impulses being transmitted. Once you look at the auditory pathway, auditory impulses are transmitted and they ascend the brainstem. So auditory impulses pass through the cochlear nuclei in the medulla. As it ascends the medulla, it reaches the pons where you have the superior olivary nuclei. So it passes through the superior olivary nuclei in the pons to the inferior colliculus of the midbrain before projecting to the auditory centers for interpretation of auditory impulses. So once you locate the inferior olivary nucleus, don't forget where the superior olivary nucleus is located. So we move to the vestibular nucleus located in the medulla. The vestibular nucleus houses the sensory cell bodies of the vestibular nerve, which relays vestibular posture and equilibrium function. Remember where the vestibular impulses are coming from. They are coming from the vestibular apparatus in the ear, in the inner ear. Remember the semicircular canals, the otoliths, and so on, the vestibular apparatus. So the vestibular nucleus is located in the medulla. It houses the sensory nerve bodies relaying information from the vestibular apparatus. So now, the vestibular nucleus relays vestibular posture and equilibrium function to various components of the brainstem. It has connections with the superior colliculus as well. It also has connections with the cerebellum. Okay, remember when we talked about the way vestibular stimulation affects eye movement, because there are connections between the vestibular nucleus and the superior colliculus that also integrates eye movement. And also most of the vestibular impulses are sent to the brainstem and the cerebellum for interpretation. Now, fibers of those vestibulospinal tracts from the vestibular nuclei are associated with the cerebellum, like I've just said. We have cerebellovestibular fibers, fibers originating from the cerebellum to the vestibular nuclei, and also fibers originating from the vestibular nuclei to the cerebellum. They are associated with each other and the cerebellum. So the cerebellovestibular fibers originating from the deep nuclei, the fastigial nucleus of the cerebellum, and exiting through the superior cerebellar peduncle as they enter the vestibular nuclei. So these connections and association can therefore subsequently result in the cerebellum indirectly influencing spinal control. So in response to stimulus or impulses coming from the vestibular nuclei or the vestibulospinal nuclei, the cerebellum itself can also result or can also have a hand in influencing spinal control in response to vestibular impulses that are coming into it. So that is the function of that connection, the vestibulospinal tract and the cerebellovestibular fibers. So we are still on the brainstem, the role of the brainstem in the control of movement. So still on the medulla, we are looking at the structures that are located in the medulla. We have seen the vestibular nucleus, we have seen the inferior olivary nucleus. I talked about the superior olivary nucleus in the pons. And we also have the cochlear nucleus. Remember, the cochlear nucleus is also located in the medulla. I hope you know the function of the cochlear nucleus, which integrates auditory impulses coming from the ear. Okay, don't forget the cochlear nucleus is there in when we're talking about the spatial sense of hearing. Okay, so you go and check up the functions of the cochlear nucleus located also in the medulla. So we move to the role of the diencephalon. When we talk about the diencephalon, what comes to your mind? So we are only going to look at the thalamus, the role of the thalamus under this heading, the role of the thalamus in the control of movements. So when you look at this diagram that I talked to you about earlier, you're going to see the connection, the efferent connections from the cerebellar cortex to the dentate nucleus, which is the deep nucleus, and from the dentate nucleus via the radionucleus to the ventrolateral nucleus of thalamus. And from the ventrolateral nucleus of thalamus to the cerebral cortex. This is the diencephalon. This is the thalamus. So looking at the role of the diencephalon in the control of movements, most of the pathways, most of the efferent pathways from extrapyramidal structures and even from the motor cortex passes through the thalamus. So for example, this is the dentorubro-thalamic cortical tract that we have been talking about. So that is what this diagram shows you. So the diagram showing the connection between the cerebellum, the lateral cerebellum, which is the cerebrocerebellum, and the cerebral cortex via the thalamus. And that part of the thalamus is the ventrolateral nucleus of thalamus. So that is the dentatothalamic cortical tract. Or you call it the dentorubro-thalamic cortical tract. So we move ahead. So output, what's the function of that tract now? Output from the cerebrocerebellum provides information used for coordination of involuntary movements. The output from the cerebellum via that tract provides information that is used for coordination of voluntary movements initiated by the motor cortex. Remember, the cerebrocerebellum is also involved in the planning of voluntary movements. Alongside the basal ganglia, the idea is conceived by the prefrontal cortex. The cerebrocerebellum is also involved in the coordination of voluntary movements initiated by the motor cortex. So that is the function of that pathway, that tract that you are seeing here. That tract you are seeing here ascending through the thalamus to the cerebral cortex. In case you are asked, what is the function of that tract? What is the function of the dentorubro-thalamic cortical tract? You will not be found wanting, okay? So let's move ahead. We're still on the role of the diencephalon. So now we are talking about the thalamus itself. We have seen the midbrain, we have seen the pons, we have seen the medulla, we have seen the structures located in these areas of the brainstem. So now in the thalamus, we have seen one of the functions of the dentorubro-thalamic cortical tract. Now, this diagram also shows you the connection between the cerebellum, the intermediate cerebellum, or the spinocerebellum, and the cerebral cortex via the thalamus. The spinocerebellum, which is the intermediate cerebellum. In the previous slide, we talked about the cerebrocerebellum. We are done with that. We have seen the function. The intermediate cerebellum or the spinocerebellum, what is the function of the spinocerebellum? It plays a role in planning and practicing rapid complex motor actions And it also plays a role in motor learning. Motor learning. I told you the motor system learns by doing. Okay, that is the functions of the spinal cerebellum. So this diagram shows the connection between the cerebellum, intermediate cerebellum or spinal cerebellum, and the cerebral cortex via the thalamus. The thalamus is the main subject of concern because it's part of the diencephalon. So we are looking at the role of the diencephalon, thalamus in quotes, in the control of movement. So that connection is via the dentato-thalamic fibers, the dentorubro-thalamic fibers. So you can see the connection here from the nucleus interpositions, the efferent output synapses in the nucleus, and then gives rise to fibers exiting the intermediate cerebellum via the superior cerebellar peduncle, via the radionucleus. As it passes, it sends collateral to the radionucleus before the fibers project to the intralaminar nucleus of thalamus, and also the ventrolateral and the ventro-anterior nuclei of thalamus. From there, the next order of neuron projects from the thalamus to the motor cortex. You can also see from the radionucleus here, as the collateral passes here, it connects with the rubrospinal tract, which descends directly into the spinal cord. And you know the function of the rubrospinal tract that we mentioned earlier in this lesson. Now, as the fibers ascend to the motor cortex in turn sends down motor commands via the corticospinal tract. You can see the connection now. Okay, so that is the role of the diencephalon. So the role of this pathway from the intermediate cerebellum to the thalamus via the radionucleus and to the motor cortex is for coordination of reciprocal muscle contractions. Contractions of agonist and antagonist muscles is coordinated by this pathway from the intermediate zone of the cerebellum up to the cerebral cortex. That is the pathway that integrates these functions of reciprocal contractions of agonist and antagonist muscles. Okay, so this is what I've just explained now. Output from the intermediate cerebellum plays a role in coordination of reciprocal contractions of muscle. Remember, we have agonist and antagonist muscles at joints and on some of the limbs. So in agonist and antagonist muscles, you can see such movements in ballistic movements, like punching or throwing a strike. That is the action of the agonist and antagonist muscles. An example, a typical example of agonist and antagonist muscles in action. Those actions are coordinated and the efferent are sent through the from the intermediate zone of the cerebellum up to the motor cortex. So the coordination of that action is between this pathway that you have seen here. So remember, still on the role of the diencephalon, we have seen the role of this diencephalon in the pathway from the cerebellum to the motor cortex via the radionucleus. Also remember, and don't forget, we have the thalamus when it comes to the basal ganglia. Remember the role of the basal ganglia in movement, okay? So don't forget the role of the thalamus in the basal ganglia. It has connections with the basal ganglia. Okay, remember the basal ganglia has to do with the function is modifying and refining motor activities. The basal ganglia also plays a role in planning and organizing and refining and coordinating motor movements. So there are two main outputs from the basal ganglia, from the structures of the basal ganglia. We have from the globus pallidus internal segment here, globus pallidus internal segment to the thalamus. Then we also have from the substantia nigra pars reticulata to the thalamus. They are all inhibitory projections to the thalamus. And the thalamus then projects an excitatory, presumably glutamate fibers to excite the cerebral cortex, preferably the prefrontal and the premotor cortex. And you know the roles of the prefrontal and the premotor cortex, just explained in the previous lectures. So you see, the two main outputs are inhibitory to the thalamus, and the main output from the thalamus to the motor cortex is excitatory. The role of the diencephalon in the control of movements, okay? So now, what is the function or the significance of that pathway, of that connection? So remember still, the full cortical basal ganglia thalamic cortical loop, or the motor circuit from the cortical basal ganglia thalamic cortical loop, or the motor circuit from the cortex to the basal ganglia, and from the thalamus, the main two outputs from the basal ganglia to the thalamus, and the thalamic cortical loop, or the motor circuit, allows intended movements to occur while inhibiting unintended movements. That is the function of that pathway, of that connection between output coming into the thalamus and the thalamus connecting directly to the cerebral cortex. So that is what I wanted to explain about the role of the diencephalon when it comes to connections with the basal ganglia. So you see, we have the thalamus here, and most of the outputs from the basal ganglia terminate in the thalamus as the thalamus projects with excitatory output to the cerebral cortex there. So after planning and programming of movements by the cortex, the basal ganglia and the cerebellum, all of them, the three of them, after planning and programming of movements by the three of them, the cortex, basal ganglia, and cerebellum, the basal ganglia and the cerebellum funnel information to the premotor cortex. We had already explained that in the previous lecture. The information is funneled via thalamus. When you look at the next slide here, you understand what I'm saying. So after these two guys have planned the movement, the lateral cerebellum, the basal ganglia plan the movement, and they funnel the information by way of the thalamus. The thalamus is here, the thalamus is also here, to the premotor and motor cortex, which will now execute the movement. As the movement is being executed, there is always comparator action of the cerebellum. So the cerebellum, the intermediate cerebellum, will always receive sensory information from the muscle spindles on how the movement is being carried out. And as it receives the information, it compares and sends a feedback to the premotor cortex to alert the premotor cortex of what is going on. Is the movement going according to plan? Okay, so as it funnels the information from the intermediate cerebellum, funneling the sensory information back into the premotor and motor cortex, it also passes by the way of thalamus. So that's why I said this flow diagram has explanation of the previous slide, showing the communication between the basal ganglia, the cortex, the cerebellum, by the way of the thalamus. The thalamus is located here, here, and also here. So funneling of information about the intended movement passes through the thalamus. You can't bypass the thalamus. So that is the role of the thalamus, the role of the diencephalon in the control of movements. It also plays a role in the basal ganglia, as we have seen the two main outputs from the globus pallidus internal segment and also from the substantia nigra pars reticulata, funneling the two outputs to the thalamus, and the thalamus in turn excites the cerebral cortex. The purpose of that connection is to allow intended movement to occur while inhibiting unintended movements. So let's move on. So we have seen the role of the thalamus. We have seen the role of the thalamus in different concepts. We have seen its role in the basal ganglia. We have seen its role in funneling and channeling of information. Now, which part of the thalamus is mainly involved in the control of movements? Which part of the thalamus is involved? We have the motor thalamus. The motor thalamus is made up of the ventral anterior and the ventral lateral nuclei. Is implicated in the control of movement because that thalamus, that part of the thalamus is strategically located between the motor areas of the cerebral cortex and the motor-related subcortical structures, which are the cerebellum, the basal ganglia. So when you look at this flow diagram, you will see it is strategically located between the basal ganglia and the motor cortex, between the intermediate cerebellum and the motor cortex, between the premotor cortex and the lateral cerebellum. Okay, so it is strategically located. That is why it is known as the motor thalamus. As it is strategically located, it also receives motor information, integrates them, excuse me, integrates motor information before sending it either to the cerebral cortex, the premotor or motor cortex, or channeling it between the basal ganglia and the cerebellum and some subcortical structures. So the motor thalamus consists of the ventral anterior and the ventral lateral nuclei implicated in the control of movement. So the motor thalamus acts as a super integrator of motor information because it converges motor information from the cortex basal ganglia and from the cortex and the cerebellum. It is not simply a relay center for signals. What it does is that it assimilates motivational and proprioceptive motor information. It assimilates motivational and proprioceptive motor information that is being, as that information is being passed between the basal ganglia, the premotor cortex, and the intermediate cerebellum, it assimilates motivational and proprioceptive motor information previously integrated in these structures that I've mentioned to develop sophisticated motor signals that are transmitted in pathways to cortical areas for optimal generation of motor programs. I hope you understand what I'm trying to say. So it assimilates this motor, let's say it assimilates some primitive motor commands and proprioceptive motor informations. As it assimilates them, it generates into sophisticated motor signals before transmitting it to the motor cortex. And the motor cortex will now execute the sophisticated motor signals that has been passed through the thalamus to the effector organs or the muscles for execution of movement. Okay, so what are the roles of the spinal cord? We are now done with the role of the diencephalon. The diencephalon is over now. The role of the diencephalon in controlling movement. We saw the dentorubro-thalamic cortical tract. We saw its role, the role of the diencephalon in the basal ganglia, connections with the basal ganglia. We saw the parts of the thalamus that are known as the motor thalamus and the functions. Why is it so important in the control of movement? So let's move to the spinal cord. The role of the spinal cord in the control of movements. Now, all these things won't be possible if the spinal cord is removed, because the spinal cord houses the main motor tracts. When you are talking about the motor system, the motor tracts are there. The direct and the indirect motor tracts pass through the spinal cord. Don't forget. So I said the pathways of the motor system are the direct pathways, which are the corticospinal and the corticobulbar tracts. And we also have the indirect pathway, also known as the subconscious pathway or the extrapyramidal pathway, which are the structures, which are the pathways that originate from structures outside the motor cortex. We have the rubrospinal tract, we have the vestibulospinal tract, and so on. So the functions of this indirect pathway is to regulate fine motor control of upper limbs and distal muscles. For example, the cerebrospinal tract that we saw from the ready nucleus. The indirect pathway also, the function is also to maintain posture, upright posture. For example, the vestibulospinal tract. The reticulospinal tract also plays a role in maintenance of posture as well. So all these tracts, motor tracts, passes through the spinal cord. There's no way they can reach the muscles without passing through the spinal cord. And they have to make connections with the lower motor neurons, don't forget. So the axons of neurons from the motor cortex, these are the direct pathways now. Axons of neurons from the motor cortex, primary and supplementary motor cortex that project to the spinal motor neurons form the corticospinal tracts, which are the direct pathways. Remember, we have the corticospinal tract and the corticobulbar tracts. So a large bundle of about 1 million fibers descend. 80% of the fibers, as they descend in the corticospinal tract, decussate at the level of the pyramids. Okay, they decussate and descend to form the lateral corticospinal tracts that can make monosynaptic connections with the lower motor neurons. Okay, so the lateral corticospinal tract supplies all levels of the body, upper and lower limbs, all the muscles in the upper and lower limbs, all levels. Then 20% of the fibers descend to form the ventral corticospinal tract. The ventral corticospinal tract or the anterior corticospinal tract. That tract supplies the neck and the upper limbs. So 80% decussates, 20% continues as the ventral corticospinal tract. But when the ventral corticospinal tract reaches the anterior horn of the spinal cord, it will decussate at the level of the spinal cord before making connections, disynaptic connections with the spinal motor neurons or the lower motor neurons. I hope you are all with me. So that is what I've explained here. The fibers cross and some fibers remain uncrossed. For the ventral division of the tract, they remain uncrossed until reaching the spinal cord. And the axons terminate on the spinal interneurons antecedent to the motor neurons. Okay, so they have disynaptic and monosynaptic connections made by the ventral corticospinal tract and the lateral corticospinal tract, respectively. So this is what I've illustrated here for what we have explained already. So you can see the corticospinal tracts decussating. You can see the lateral corticospinal tract making monosynaptic connections with the lower motor neurons, and see the ventral corticospinal tract reaches the level of the spinal cord, making disynaptic connections with the lower motor neurons and decussating at the level of the spinal cord. Don't forget the parts of the regions of the body that each of these corticospinal tracts innervates. So let's move ahead. So we move to the second direct pathway, motor pathway, which is the corticobulbar tract. So the corticobulbar motor fiber pathways connect the cerebral motor cortex to the motor neurons in the brain stem. So the corticospinal tract has neurons, connects to neurons in the anterior gray horn of the spinal cord, whereas the corticobulbar tract makes connections with the nuclei, motor nuclei located in the brainstem, and those motor nuclei gives rise to neurons like trigeminal nerves, fascial nerves, and the hypoglossal nerves. So these are the nuclei in which the corticobulbar tract makes contact with in the brainstem. Okay, so located on the medullary pyramids of the brainstem's medulla oblongata. That region where these nuclei are located is known as the bulbar region. So the corticobulbar fibers end either directly on the cranial nerve nuclei or on the antecedent interneuron before the interneural now links to the cranial nerve nuclei. Maybe the cranial nerve nuclei of the trigeminal nerve, facial nerve, hypoglossal nerve, and so on. Excuse me. So the axons, this is now the pathway of the corticobulbar tract. This is how it moves, okay? To descend in the corticospinal tract fiber in the pons and the medulla before getting to the effectors. So the corticospinal and the corticobulbar system is the primary pathway for, excuse me, for the initiation of skilled voluntary movement. Remember the function of the corticospinal tract? Skilled voluntary movement that require dexterity. That is the function of the corticospinal tract. So both of them, corticospinal, corticobulbar system, is the primary pathway for initiation of skilled voluntary movement that require complex interactions between sensory input and the motor cortex. Remember, there's a communication between the supplementary motor cortex and the somatosensory area. Okay, there is also always a connection between sensory and motor inputs. So, for example, movements like grasping of small objects and making isolated movements of the wrists. You know, you can move your wrist without the whole upper arm moving, okay? So those are the type of movements that are, that's their primary pathway is the corticospinal and the corticobulbar systems or tracts. So this is what happens when there is damage to the lateral corticospinal tract. You read that up. So we move on to the extrapyramidal motor system, which I've already talked about, which is the indirect pathway. I've talked about the functions. It is largely controlled by motor circuits, structures in the basal ganglia. We talk about the corpus striatum and other structures of the basal ganglia, as well as the substantia nigra and the thalamus. They are the ones that control the extrapyramidal motor system. Okay, and even the motor cortex also exerts control over the extrapyramidal motor system. So the extrapyramidal motor system, these are the functions. I've already talked about the functions. Subconscious motor control, it is also known as the subconscious system, initiation of body movements, maintenance of posture, control of muscles of facial expression, control of muscles of the head and neck, maintenance of upright posture, regulating fine motor control of the upper limbs and the distal muscles, especially the rubrospinal tract. Those are the functions of the extrapyramidal motor system, in case you are asked somewhere. So don't forget. So this diagram shows you the divisions of the spinal cord, how the tracts, the descending tracts pass through, where they pass through in the spinal cord, the white matter of the spinal cord, which contains the ascending and the descending tracts there. So you can see on the left side of the screen, you can see the pyramidal tracts there. You can see the extrapyramidal tracts where they descend through in the spinal cord. We are still on the role of the spinal cord in the control of body movement. I hope you now understand the role of the spinal cord. It is there to provide passageway for the descending tracts. And it makes it possible for the descending tracts to make communication with the lower motor neurons. Okay, so that is the main role of the spinal cord in the control of body movements. It won't be possible for the descending tracts, be it pyramidal or extrapyramidal tracts, to make synapses with the lower motor neurons without the presence of the spinal cord. So this figure shows you the pyramidal and extrapyramidal tracts of the spinal cord. So that takes us to the role of the final common pathway in the control of movements. When we talk about the final common pathway, what comes to your mind? So we have cell bodies of the upper motor neurons. Remember, cell bodies of the upper motor neurons are in the cortex and the brain stem. Remember the motor system. The cell bodies of the upper motor neurons are in the cortex and the brain stem. nuclei. Likewise, cell bodies of the lower motor neurons are located in the anterior horns of the spinal gray matter and in the cranial nerve nuclei of the brainstem. So that is where the lower motor neurons nuclei are located. In the anterior horn of the spinal gray matter and the cranial nuclei of the brainstem. The lower motor neurons nuclei are located there, and the lower motor neurons will arise from there. Now, the motor system being divided into the upper and lower motor neurons, which I have told you where their nuclei are located in the cortex and the brainstem, in the anterior spinal gray horn, and in the cranial nuclei of the brainstem, you see. So now, let's look at the upper motor neurons, especially those where the nuclei are located in the cortex. So here I have also said upper motor neurons are those in the cortex and the brainstem that activate lower motor neurons. Lower motor neurons are also located in the anterior spinal gray matter, anterior horns of the spinal gray matter, and also in the cranial nerve nuclei of the brainstem. So the lower motor neurons refer to the spinal and cranial motor neurons that directly innervate from that nuclei where they are located, either in the brainstem, either in the anterior horn of the gray matter, anterior horn of the spinal gray matter. The lower motor neurons will take their course from those two locations there, those two nuclei there. So the corticospinal pathways provide the final common pathway to motor neurons. The final common pathways can arise either from the cranial nerve nuclei of the brainstem or from the spinal anterior horns of the spinal gray matter of the spinal cord. They can arise from those two places. So looking at the spinal cord, since we are concerned with the role of the final common pathway and the role of the spinal cord in the control of movement, we want to look at the lower motor neurons, the nuclei located in the gray matter, the anterior gray matter of the spinal cord. So the final common pathway linking the central nervous system to the skeletal muscles is the alpha motor neurons. So the alpha motor neurons are there to bring about that communication linking the central nervous system to the skeletal muscles. So as the motor commands are coming down from the central nervous system, for them to reach the skeletal muscles, the final common pathway must be through the alpha motor neurons. So the alpha motor neurons supply the extrafisal fibers. Remember this muscle spindle. They supply the extrafisal fibers in skeletal muscles and are the efferent site of many reflex arcs. The efferent site of many reflex arcs. So all neural influences affecting muscular contraction are ultimately funneled through the alpha motor neurons to the muscles. So all the inputs coming from the higher centers, be it extrapyramidal, be it pyramidal, be it corticobulbar, corticospinal, they are funneled through the alpha motor neurons. So the alpha motor neurons that supply the extrafisal fibers in skeletal muscles are the efferent side of many reflex arcs. So for a reflex arc to be complete, that involves the skeletal muscle, the alpha motor neuron must be involved. So that alpha motor neuron is known as the final common pathway that is involved in the control of movement. So let's move ahead. So numerous inputs converge on the alpha motor neurons. In addition to this, there are excitatory and inhibitory inputs. Although the lower motor neurons, the connections between the lower motor neurons and the skeletal muscles are always excitatory. The stimulation of the lower motor neurons has an excitatory effect on the skeletal muscles, but converging of input on the lower motor neurons can either be excitatory or inhibitory. So generally, they are relayed via interneurons. These excitatory and inhibitory inputs pass through interneurons. Remember, the lateral corticospinal tract and the anterior corticospinal tract is either they are monosynaptic or disynaptic. So, from other levels of the spinal cord and multiple long descending tracts from the brain, those inputs converge on the alpha motor neuron. So when you look at this diagram here, you will see the IB fibers from the Golgi tendon, the main afferents from the extraphyseal fibers of the muscle spindle, okay, entering the dorsal root ganglion into the gray matter of the spinal cord, and then making a connection, direct connection with the motor end plates, which gives rise to the alpha or the gamma motor neurons, or the alpha motor neurons, because this motor end plates ends on the extraphyseal fibers, and the nerves innervating the extraphyseal fibers from the anterior gray matter of the spinal cord is the alpha motor neuron. So you can also see the IA fiber from the intraphyseal part of the muscle spindle. This is from the Golgi tendon. The IB is from the Golgi tendon. The IA is from the muscle spindle. So it also converges on the motor neuron, the nuclei of the motor neuron in the anterior gray horn of the spinal cord, and then innervates the extraphyseal fiber of the muscle spindle via the alpha motor neuron. So this is the connection, how it goes about, the role of the final common pathway. So the alpha motor neuron is the final common pathway. The sensory afferents from the muscle spindle or from the proprioceptors terminates in interneurons, which connects to the alpha motor neurons, which are the final common pathway. So here, the IB fiber terminates on an interneuron, releasing inhibitory mediators that can help to inhibit the action of the alpha motor neurons. Okay, well, as we go further, we are going to see the function of the alpha motor neurons on the skeletal muscles. What is the function of the alpha motor neurons there? So as you have seen that flow chart now, as you have seen that connection there, all of these pathways from other levels of the spinal cord coming down from the motor cortex and other multiple descending tracts from the extrapyramidal tract converge and determine the activity of the final common pathway. All the pathways, be it corticospinal, corticobulbar, extrapyramidal, they converge finally on the final common pathways, and they determine the activity of the final common pathways. So the final common pathways itself are responsible for stretching and contraction responses of skeletal muscles. Don't forget, they are responsible for the stretch reflex, the myotatic reflex, the alpha motor neuron. So the final common pathways are the ones responsible because they are the final. All the inputs coming from the upper motor neuron, coming from the motor cortex, will terminate on the final common pathway, which are the alpha motor neurons. And these alpha motor neurons are the ones responsible for stretch reflexes or myotatic reflexes. So the alpha motor neurons, as we have seen there, innervates extraphyseal fibers of the muscle spindle. We saw muscle spindle some time ago. We saw it has the extraphyseal and the intraphyseal fibers. So the alpha motor neurons innervate the extraphyseal fibers of the skeletal muscles and are directly responsible for initiating contraction in the skeletal muscles via stretch reflex, myotatic reflex. So for them to initiate contraction in the muscle, they have to initiate stretch reflex. So the lower motor neurons also play a role in maintaining muscle tone. That is when the gamma motor neurons come into play. So the resistance of a muscle to stretch, once you stretch a muscle and it resists, is often referred to as tone, muscle tone. Okay, that tone that a muscle always maintains when it is stretched is known as muscle tone, and it is mediated by the gamma motor neurons. So muscles are generally hypotonic when the rate of the gamma motor neuron discharge is low. So once the rate of the gamma motor neuron discharge is low, the muscle tone starts disappearing. And what you are going to observe is hypotonia, flaccidity. And the muscle will tend to be hypertonic when the discharge from the gamma motor neuron is high. Hypertonia, spasticity. Okay, so let's move on. So the muscle tone, remember what brings about muscle tone now. The muscle tone plays an important role in maintenance of posture, the role of the final common pathway in the control of movements. Muscle tone is very important in the maintenance of posture. If the postural muscles lose their tone, the individual will not be able to maintain a posture. So changes in the muscle tone enables movement of different parts of the body. For you to make a movement, for you to walk, the muscle tone of different muscles in the legs and the body have to change to make you to walk. You are not going to walk like a robot. You walk and show flexibility. You can see how the machine works, the way a robot works. It doesn't work like a normal human being. So what makes you work like a normal human being and makes people to appreciate that, oh, that's a person who's walking, is the changes in the muscle tones of the body that enables movement of different parts of the body. When you are walking, different parts of the body are coordinating. You are turning your neck, you are swinging your arms, so people can walk in style, It's as a result of changes in the muscle tone that enables movement of different parts of the body at the same time. So stretch reflexes. What brings about stretch reflexes? The alpha motor neurons. They are responsible for stretch reflexes. Stretch reflexes functions in the maintenance of posture at rest. When you are at rest, what maintains the posture? For you to stand erect, for you to sit erect, at rest, and during movement, what maintains posture? When you are walking, you walk upright. You don't walk in a curved manner. You walk straight, your back is straightened, and you move. Okay? So stretch reflexes functions in the maintenance of posture. Stretch reflexes that are mediated by the alpha motor neurons. That is the function. Postural reflexes. They maintain postural reflexes at rest and during movement. So those are the roles of the final common pathway. We have the alpha motor neurons and we have the gamma motor neurons. You should know their functions as well as how they help to control movements. Okay? So this is an example of how posture is corrected. Maybe when someone is leaning to one side, the function of the stretch reflex is to correct posture. This is an example, as I have shown here, the steps that happens when a person starts leaning to one side. The postural muscles are there to correct the posture. Maybe when the person is falling out of posture, the muscle spindles in these muscles will detect the stretch, and the stretch muscles will contract to correct posture, the effect of the alpha motor neurons. So thank you for listening to this session. I hope when you have questions, you can direct to me on my number or on my email, and I hope to hear from you soon. Thank you.